As of the published date of this episode, I am an associate of Ulta Beauty. The ideas and thoughts represented here are my own and not that of my employer.
Thank you for tuning in to the Scaling Emerging Beauty podcast today. This podcast offers actionable insights and strategies to help early stage emerging brands scale from 0 to 20 million, specifically focusing on opportunities for growth via big retail. I'm your host, Monique Benoit, and every episode I sit down with founders, retail experts, and enthusiasts to talk about different strategies to help emerging brands that are in the trenches today, or for those that love beauty and love retail and want to hear what's buzzing for emerging beauty brands. For this week's episode, I got a chance to sit down with Abby Richards, the CPG CFO. Abby shared some fantastic insights on finances, which we know are a super critical topic right now. Here's a snippet from our conversation.
Investors want to make money. When they give you money, they want it to grow, right? They want it to come back bigger. So in order for that to happen, you have to grow. And if you're funding your poor margins with their money, that's not going to be growth, right? They want to see you putting it toward like marketing, slotting, right? Like free fills. They want to be able to see your business go like this. And so that's just one more reason that profitability is super important.
Now let me tell you a little bit more about Abby. Abby is the founder of the CPG CFO, and she serves emerging CPG brands with fractional CFO services by helping brands know their numbers and build sustainable businesses. I said sustainable businesses, guys. That is so crucial in today's day and age. Abby loves reading the ingredients for the food that she feeds her family, and she's super passionate about expanding access to better for you and sustainable food options. She spent nearly 7 years in a large public accounting firm before starting the CPG CFO. And she's seen various industries in auditing, outsourced accounting, technology implementation. Basically, Abby is definitely your go-to if you want to make sure your finances are together. I am super excited that I was able to have her on the podcast today, and think that you all are going to learn so much about your own personal finances through today's conversation. We'll hear a brief word from our sponsor, and then we'll get right into the episode. I'd like to take a moment to thank the sponsor for the Scaling Emerging Beauty podcast, the Emerson Group. Through their support, we're able to continue to talk to industry experts to provide early stage brands with strategies and tactical insights on what they can do to help their business grow better. Thank you again to the Emerson Group for their continued support. And let's go ahead and continue with the show. So happy to have you on the podcast today to discuss all things finance. I think it's an especially critical conversation to have given everything that's going on in the CPG industry. I mean, as of the time of this recording in May of 2024, we've seen so many articles coming out sharing that brands that have distribution across thousands of stores are closing and shuttering. And a big reason why oftentimes is because of profitability. So with that being said, founders are often focused on marketing the product, which makes sense. That's how you get the word out there. Developing the product itself, which also makes sense because you need a stellar product. But finances are really important too. I'd love to kick off the conversation by talking about what are some of the most critical financial metrics that a new brand should track, and how you would recommend a new brand track them.
Yeah, absolutely. So the most critical financial metric for a CPG brand is contribution margin dollars. Some people call it dollar sales contribution per unit. The question that it answers is how much money is left after I sell one of these, right? Like one of your products, after accounting for every incremental or variable cost. So, the cost of customer acquisition, trade spend, fulfillment, the freight out, all that stuff is the most critical metric, because that's kind of how you're your financials really work. It's not a gap measure, right? General accepted accounting principles. It's not a gap measure. It's management accounting. So it's not something that you're going to see in a financial statement, for like a public company, but it's critical to understand, because if you think about it, you've got your revenue, you've got your contra revenue, get to net revenue, and then you're going to have your cost of goods sold. Your gross profit's great, right? But a lot of, the way that I set up my clients is to have fulfillment, selling, advertising, whatnot below the gross profit line. So if you just look at gross profit, it doesn't tell the whole story, because your costs for fulfillment and whatnot are going to vary based on how much you sell, right? So they go up and down. They're not just a fixed cost like a lot of your other SG&A costs. So just thinking about it in that way of like, as your revenue goes up, so will those costs. And so then at the end of the day, how much do you actually make on each unit? And a question that answer will also help you answer is, how many units would I have to sell to cover my overhead? So when you think about that overhead, everything that's not variable, right? When you think about that overhead, and I'm horrible at mental math, but my husband's always like, you're an accountant. I'm like, yeah, but like counting is not part of it. So if you sell 10,000 of a unit, and let's just say your contribution margin per unit is in dollars is $10, right? So you'd have to sell 1,000 of those if your SG&A is your fixed costs are 10,000. So then it's like, okay, that's great. We'll sell 1,000. At that level, would your SG&A go up, right? Would your fixed costs actually go up? And just like thinking through all those scenarios so that you can adequately prepare for growth.
That's really good, Abby. And I think so many founders, especially, right, are not necessarily coming to this industry with the expertise of finance. Mm-hmm. And one of the toughest things I find as a founder, and you probably know this too, is that you have to be an expert at so many things. And so it's great to be able to understand some of it. Like, I find that you do need to know a little bit about almost all of the things. But then when it comes to like doing a deep dive, that's when it's helpful. Something that you mentioned that also came to mind as you were talking about the variable costs on every item was fulfillment and shipping. I know I've had lots of conversations, especially in health and beauty, where in some cases you can have really heavy items. Mm-hmm. Like, especially when you're talking about, liquid. 12-ounce bottles of shit. Right. The liquids are heavy, Yeah. And so you might have, a serum that could be fairly lightweight because it's maybe 2 ounces. But then if you also have a shampoo, again, that's 12 ounces, that's going to have a very different weight. And so that's where it also is important to not just look at your top line sales to that point, because you could be selling more of the heavy liquid shampoo and less of the serum, but could actually be making just as much because of that contribution margin, because of your shipping and your fulfillment costs. And so I can see how it's really important to look at it at the item level and then to consider all of those different costs. Do you find that it's easy to track these costs? Like, if I'm a new founder and I'm not a finance girly, how does one say, this is how I track it? Like, do I use an Excel spreadsheet? Am I saying, look at my costs that I'm paying to Meta for these ads, and then that's what I add into my advertising costs? Can you just like walk us through like elementary style level how that could work?
So I absolutely agree that you should use Excel at some point, right? So use Excel, map it all out. What can I actually afford to budget for customer acquisition? What's my price going to be? My shelf price, distributor price, direct retail price, all the different prices. Look at all that for sure, right? Look at that when you're budgeting. But I think that where sometimes founders fall down, I guess, is looking at it from the accounting system. So if you're looking at your sales, your results for a particular month, I think it's important to look at that and say, okay, my revenue was, again, 10,000. Let's say I sold 1,000. That seems about right. My products are on average about $10 a piece. And then looking at your advertising cost that actually hit in that month, right? Like what you actually paid. And then doing the math to see, okay, so I paid 4,000, okay, divided by, however many, divided by 1,000, okay, like $4 a piece. That's how much I'm actually paying. Because when you look at the metrics for a particular, let's say you're in Amazon, you're in Shopify, based on the different platforms, they're going to have different attribution as to who actually drove the revenue, right? Because was it the email or was it this text message? They're going to over attribute their contribution to your sales, right? So it's super important to actually look at your results at the end of the month, what actually hit your accounting system, because that doesn't lie. So doing the math there. And then I would also recommend, you asked about tracking it. I would recommend using dimensionality in the financials. So QuickBooks, you can use what's called classes. If you're in like a NetSuite, you can use classes, locations, and departments. There's different things you can use, and you can rename them in your accounting system so that they don't say like class, right? So they can say channel. And then if you book your costs to that, with that like tag, right? We call it a dimension because if you think about your financials and you're thinking about just your chart of accounts and, months, that's like one dimensional, right? Whereas if you add on an additional tag, now you can look at it from a different perspective and see, okay, but how much did I make per bottom line per channel, right? If you tag that. So you can like stratify it into different columns versus what a lot of people do is they blow out their chart of accounts vertically. So then it gets super long and it's impossible to look at and say, what were my actual results? How much did I actually make on this channel? So that's what I recommend, tagging to where you can pull a P&L by class is what it will be in QuickBooks. And you can actually see what goes into all those different buckets, right? If you pay for the Amazon advertising, if you pay for TikTok or Instagram, and that's sending people to your D2C store, you can kind of assume that that is the cost for those customers. Now, there is some cost that's going to translate. If you're advertising online for D2C and you're advertising in areas where you're on shelf, that's going to benefit you on shelf, right? So it's more of an art than a science, but it will help. You can at least look at it. It's better than just wondering. So.
And it also sounds like that's going to give you a much better idea of your overall profitability, which, is like a key focus for why I wanted to bring you on to talk about this, because profitability is mattering so much more for brands.
Yes, profitability. So there's some strategy there, right? Like you want to know if you're profitable in a particular channel. You may be okay with not being profitable in a particular channel, right? So maybe
say more.
Okay, well, let's just talk about Amazon, right? So there's a lot of reasons to be on Amazon that don't have to do with actually being profitable. So protecting your brand, right? Trying to make sure that other people aren't selling your brand on there, making sure, you're in the buy box, right? And having control over the way that your brand shows up on Amazon, able to control the listings and what's there. And as I'm sure do a lot of research on Amazon, you may be sitting in a store, and I've done it. Oh, that's an interesting brand. Like that looks super, super fun product, I'm interested, right? Like, but I'm not sure, like how much is it? Could I just get it on Amazon? Or do people like it, right? Are there reviews on Amazon? So people actually use Amazon as a way to vet products that they may want to buy. That's a reason that has nothing to do with profitability to be on Amazon. So I want you to know as a founder if you are profitable on Amazon and how profitable you are on Amazon. And there are ways to maximize that profitability, right? But that's not to say if you're breaking even on your Amazon sales that, oh, you shouldn't be in Amazon, right? So there's definitely some strategy there. That's why I mentioned I want you to know, but then that's the fuel that gives you the decision-making power, not necessarily to just fully rely on that, because there's a lot more to it.
Okay. That makes sense. Thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah.
I know as we talk a lot about building a business, talking about profitability, investment is a big piece of the equation that comes up. And the type of the investment, the size of the investment, where you get the funds from can really vary based on what stage you're in. Mm-hmm. Do you have recommendations for brands in terms of how to allocate funds across key functions like product development, marketing, operations? Do you say that kind of depends on where they are in terms of scaling, what their goals are? I'm curious to say, is there a general rule of thumb that says, hey, if you allocate your funds to product development, that's going to get this ROI. Or if you allocate these funds to marketing, and maybe it's like it doesn't matter, it just comes back down to profitability. You talked about those dimensions, but I thought I would ask the question because I get, a lot of time founders will say, if I'm pitching to this angel investor, how do I say I want to allocate the funds? So would love your take on that.
Right. So I think if you're pitching to an investor, one thing, I can say more about this, but one thing that they're going to want to know is that you're using those funds for growth and not to basically cover over unprofitability, right? So if you're going to an investor, they want to give you money and they want it to come back to them. So, and they want it to be bigger. So if you have a business that's steadily burning cash, flat growth, maybe slight growth, they're not going to look at that and say, oh, if I give them money, then I can get a return on my investment. They're going to think, I'm going to fund their unprofitability, right? I'm going to fund their losses is what it boils down to. So that is, it just goes back to your points about profitability. It's critical, right? To at a minimum have a path to profitability. You don't have to be profitable necessarily. I mean, I cannot speak for all investors, right? I mean, I am not an investor, so I can't speak for any investor because I'm not an investor, but I can tell you that I do know investors want to make money. I can say that with 100% certainty. When they give you money, they want it to grow, right? They want it to come back bigger. So in order for that to happen, you have to grow. And if you're funding your poor margins with their money, that's not going to be growth, right? They want to see you putting it toward like marketing, slotting, right? Like free fills. They want to be able to see your business go like this. And so that's just one more reason that profitability is super important. There's another way to answer that, and that's around like benchmarking, right? So thinking about what do you do with your money, right? So kind of thinking about it from that perspective. I mean, I know that you work with brands that are actually scaling, right? But let's just talk about, 0 to 60, right? If you are a new founder and you're working on the farmer's market, your biggest focus is going to be product. So you're trying to get that first minimum viable product, get feedback, iterate, and then improve. So I would think that would be where you would be spending your money. Then maybe you have some money saved, or you borrow some money and you get some money together and you're ready to deploy it. You're definitely going to be investing, right? You're not going to reap the benefits of hiring an operations consultant right away, right? But the reduction in your cost of ingredients, increase in throughput, product quality, that's all going to show up in repeat sales. So then you have, if you're wanting to do D2C, you're going to be investing in your website and storefront. Investing in your packaging is critical, right, before a retail launch. So it's really dependent on stage and what they lack. But I would say that the most important thing is to be honest with yourself about where you need to improve. I've seen brands who've gone national but never truly branded. I've seen brands that go all in on marketing because that's the background of the co-founders, and they never really invest in operations and improving their profitability and their processes and all those types of things. So it's so dependent on the company, the category, the stage, all those things in terms of how much you actually put to each bucket.
That's interesting that you say that too, because you're naturally going to lean towards the places where you're probably comfortable as a founder. And so to your point, if you have a background in marketing, you're comfortable in marketing, you're going to invest in marketing, but lest we forget that operations is important too. And that's where I say, you know, pull in that fractional consultant who can help you with operations. I mean, you mentioned it, you might not see the benefits up front, but you can see them on the back end, and it might take a little bit longer, but if you're there for the long run, that's where those things come into play. When you were talking about the investor piece, it made me question the different ways that founders will sometimes fund their businesses. Some founders are bootstrapping. Some founders are answering to an investor. Would you share different financial advice with founders based on how they are funding their business? Like, is there a different metric maybe that you look at, or a different way that you look at spending funds if you are bootstrapped versus you have an investor? And I'm saying that implying that if you're bootstrapped, maybe the funds are a little bit harder to come by. Like, I think like in my personal life, it's like, okay, you know, funds are looking low, I'm going to cook at home instead of eating out, you know? But how would you look at that as we look at founders and businesses?
Yeah, so if you're bootstrapping, to your point, you likely need to be extremely creative and grow very strategically. Strategy is one of those words that I feel like can be a little controversial, because people hear strategy and they think, oh, like management consulting, like, you know, you're not doing any work, you're just, you know, giving your opinion and walking away, and who knows whether it's even good advice. But really, strategy in my mind is super important, and it really means saying no. So it's knowing exactly what you're trying to do and saying yes to those exact things and saying no to everything else. Staying focused is going to be super important. Knowing what you want to do, not getting distracted. So on the other hand, if you have an investor, right, they're going to have an opinion about your business. So you're going to have to work with them. They may not be technically your boss, but they are going to have an opinion on how you run your business. And you're going to have agreed to some things, probably as you were in discussions with them, that they're going to expect you to do. So it's a partnership, you know, it needs to be. And that's a good point to also to be very careful about who you get into partnership with. Make sure that you're aligned, your values aligned with your investor. I had a founder the other day I was talking with, and it was a female founder, and she had an investor that she had been talking to, and there was a lot of alignment in terms of, you know, it was kind of a friend of the family, friend of a friend type of thing. And so it was one of those things where she thought she could probably make it happen, right? But as she worked through everything with them, she found that they were not respectful enough of her and her time and her commitments. And she thought, it's kind of like dating. It's like, if they're not nice to you when you're dating, how are they going to act after you get married? So at that point, you don't have a choice anymore. So she very wisely told me, I think I'm done. Like, I don't think I'm going to pursue this anymore, which is really tough because, to be honest with you, that decision that she's making could mean the end of her brand. So it's a big deal, but she's also like sees the writing on the wall, right? She doesn't want to get bad money, right? So it's hopefully it doesn't end up that way, right? But it's like that was kind of, she was seeing that as a little bit of a lifeline. And to your point, you know, earlier, funding is pretty dried up, right? Like, we're not seeing a ton of money coming into the emerging CPG right now. So that was very encouraging for her, but she's, I think, going to make the decision to not pursue it. So
wise advice. And I've heard that before too, with regards to being very thoughtful about who you invest with and making sure that there's alignment, because at that point they have some ownership. And so they do have a voice, whereas previously, if you are bootstrapped, that voice is typically a voice of one. And it looks a lot different when you have someone else to answer to. So you want to make sure that they're aligned. You want to make sure that they respect you as a founder. and that they understand your business, your consumer, because in some cases, the investments that you're making are a result of maybe what you experience as a founder, a gap, let's say, in the market. And so you want to make sure that your investor trusts you enough to go after things that might not make sense to them, or that they understand that consumer when you're making those suggestions. Mm-hmm. As you talk about that, I'm thinking about receiving, again, just like receiving money, but then also thinking about fueling and funding future growth. And you talked a little bit about the balance, between those things, depending on what stage you're in. I'd love for you to just share any tips or advice you have around how emerging brands can manage cash flow to both sustain their day-to-day operations, but also invest in growth opportunities. And I know that might be harder if you're bootstrapped versus if you have investment. And maybe if you're saying you get to a point when you're bootstrapped and you're like, I can't invest anymore, and that's what makes you go out to seek funding or to seek grants. I mean, those are opportunities as well. But I'd love for you to just share how you can kind of do both, if that's possible.
Yeah, so I feel like the answer here is going to be modeling. So financial models, of course, are not the be-all, end-all. The only guarantee with a model is, as all the finance people will tell you, is that will be wrong. But it helps you think through all the different variables, right? So you could have one scenario in your model where you say, okay, let's just say that we don't go into this new channel or this new retailer. What does that look like, right? Let's say we do. What does that look like? What's my burn rate going to be? How much money do I actually need to invest in this? And making sure that you understand all those costs, whether it's like I said, slotting, free fill, promotional planning, demos, all those things that are going to be involved in going into a new area. So looking at that and knowing how much money that's going to cost. And then I feel like this is the step that's sometimes missed. It's sit with that and make a decision, right? And say, if this, and this happens, or what would have to be true for me to say yes to this? Instead of it being an automatic yes, say what would have to be true for me to say yes to this? If what would have to be true, once you see, oh, this is going to cost, $1 million to go into this retailer, then the answer is probably, I should have $1 million. Check, because realistically, the worst thing that you can do is say yes to something and then for it to be a failed launch, to get delisted. Is it going to be a lot of money, and is it going to be expensive to get all that together to support that launch? Yes. Should you probably talk with some experts, some fractional executives, different people that are experienced in that retailer or that channel to make sure that you are positioned for success? Yes. You should do all those things, because that money that you're going to spend on making it successful is really nothing compared to what it's going to cost to buy back all the inventory or mark it all down or, just get delisted and now that channel goes away, right? Or that retailer goes away. So to me, I'm not certain that brands always invest in that enough before they say yes. And maybe it's a no, right? Like maybe it has to be a no because you don't have the money. But once you have that number together and you've modeled that out, now you have the number and you can say, hey, investor, Target's calling. I need $1 million. Here's my model. Here's how it's going to help us grow. Here's what my curve looks like. And then that's a much different conversation than just being like, we keep running out of money. What are we going to do? Oh yeah, I forgot I was supposed to raise money. And so, so then you get on the phone and it's like, no, let's take like a very measured approach, a very strategic approach. And it's not a yes until, right? And that's tough. And maybe some people have to take a risk and say yes before they know, right? And they backfill it, right? It's like, okay, I'm going to say yes because they need an answer today. But it's a calculated risk. It's a calculated bet, right? I know that I have these people that are warm, right? Like that they've kind of told me, let me know when you have a big opportunity. There's a few of those, so that's good. And then you kind of cover everything. Okay, maybe I can put down a deposit on the inventory and get the raw materials going. And yeah, you just got to kind of figure out what the best choice is. But people have so many hangups about money. You know, your personal hangups about money, they don't go away when you start a business. And whenever you are the head in the sand type of person with money in general, you know, that's going to translate to your business. So try to get past that, right? Try to work with somebody that can help you with those hangups, because head in the sand is not going to work for growing a brand.
That's really, really good advice. And as you talked a little bit about some of those additional costs that can come with expanding at retail, I think it's a great time to talk a little bit about some of the additional terms or costs that come with scaling and growing at retail. I know it's one of those things where as a consumer, you're oblivious to it because it's a totally different way of doing business than what we experience as consumers. Mm-hmm. As a consumer, if I go to the store and I pay $1.50 for a pack of gum, I get my gum, and they give me, you know, if it was $1.50 with, you know, including tax, then it's even. If not, they give me change and I walk away. But payment terms, when you actually start selling into retailers, are actually quite different. You don't get paid right away, even though you're sending them product. And I think because I've been in the industry, I didn't realize how much of a surprise that was to so many founders. And it makes sense because nowhere else in life do we do that. You know, do we do this kind of, I don't want to call it an IOU, that's just the way of doing business, right? Mm-hmm. But I'd love for us to talk a little bit about like, what are some standard terms that you've seen, just so that we can share that information, not sharing anything specific to retailers, of course, but just this is what's out there. And then also just talk about how that impacts cash flow, because like I said, I know it's a surprise. And then what brands can do, maybe it's that financial modeling that you talked about to plan for it so that they can be in a good spot if they do have that retail PO and they're about to scale, but to be understanding of what that actually means and looks like financially.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that it's a surprise, not only because, you know, you say if they don't have a business background, right? So they're a consumer and they just think, you know, you make money, you get money. Same thing like your paycheck, right? So you go to work and they pay you, and it's within, you know, generally a week or two. I think it's a surprise also because people generally think growth is good. You know, sales is the goal. That's what everybody likes to talk about. It doesn't scare them. There's not a lot of discussion about this, right? What you're talking about is if you blow it out to the entire cycle, it's called the cash conversion cycle. So it's how much time does it take from the time that money goes out the door until it comes back in. So there's this cycle. It's called the cash conversion cycle. If you have to pay your co-packer before they'll even start on your production run, and it takes time to gather the raw materials, then you have to get it ready to be fulfilled, then it's shipped, and you have to wait 90 days for payment. That could be a few months, right? So that's a long time. And that money is not in your bank account. So for however many months, let's say 6 months, you have the working capital to fund that. And now you multiply that by more customers and more production runs. It gets expensive very, very quickly. And that's assuming you're profitable, right? That you're actually even going to get back more than you paid out in the first place. So it's tough. It's not easy. In terms of managing it, I would say you have to plan for your working capital needs. Don't say yes. You know, I've said it before. Don't say yes to new opportunities you can't afford. Model out your burn rate. Remember to include those average terms with customers and suppliers, so you're not thinking that you're going to get the same amount of cash back that you see on the revenue line of your P&L in the same month, right? Which is what you mentioned. And you do, you know, have to do that modeling. I would say don't try to model out your cash needs at a granular level with your financial model. Use a 13-week cash flow forecast so that you can get really granular and say, literally, this invoice is going to get paid in 30 days. You know, literally, this invoice I have to pay in 5 days. And then you kind of look at that. Okay, I started with this much cash. This is how much is going to come in. This is how much is going to go out. I got to pay my credit card. And then this is how much I'm going to have at the end of the day, ideally with some wiggle room. And then you asked about terms. So I know you mentioned, you know, maybe not even specific terms for, you know, specific retailers, but that's a lot of that information is available online. So if you Google it, you may be able to find it for a particular customer that you're thinking about getting into. But realistically, you're going to know once you're actually into a relationship with them, right? So they can be anywhere from maybe early pay at 10 to 14 days to, well, I say, okay, you may sign up for early pay 2% discount 10, right? So that's, you have to.
And what's that 2% discount? Like a 2%, I mean, just in case folks don't know, because I was also surprised to hear, so wait, you get a discount? You're giving the retailer, the customer, a discount for paying early,
Yes.
right?
Because the idea is that realistically they're financing your business by paying you early, right? So it's like an interest rate component. So let's say your invoice is $10,000. They're going to pay you 98% of it. The kicker is sometimes they'll pay you 98% of it and not pay in 10 days. So that's where you have to stay on top of it. Stay in super close contact with your AR, with that, I guess, AP manager on the other side, and stay on top of them. But like I said, so like Costco, they can get down to 14 days with early pay, and they're actually pretty good about paying, is, from what I understand. So regular terms are net 30. A lot of emerging brands appreciate that, as you can imagine. And then you've got early pay third parties. So Walmart may have like 90-day terms, right? You can get in through like their supplier inclusion program and maybe get it down to 30, just FYI. But if you are just regular off the street Walmart supplier, it's going to, believe it's net 90. So there are third party sources of early pay. One of them is called C2FO. So I've had brands have a lot of success with that. So basically you send in the invoice to your customer. They have it in their system. They approve it. Their system is kind of like visible to third parties. So there's a third party that can log in and say, oh, yep, they have this invoice that's payable in, let's just say 60 days. We're going to let them take it now, and we're going to charge them 2% or 3%. So it's not even your actual customer that's making the financing money off of you. It's a third party. So there's a lot of different ways to juggle the money balls.
That's really good and really helpful, because I think, again, that's one of the biggest surprises that I hear from brands. And what I'd love to do is to be able to just share these general business practices, because it shouldn't be hush hush. Like sometimes it feels like, oh, we can't talk about this. But realistically, if these brands are looking to scale, you need to understand what you're signing up for, what's out there, so that you can plan these financial models and you can do so sustainably. And that's really hard to do if, I feel like the information is not shared. So thank you for sharing that and for giving different options on how to consider it. Last question, just as we close, is just what advice would you give early stage founders as they're looking to grow their brands at big retail? Especially the ones that want to scale, they want to be at, the retailers with over 1,000 doors. What would you share with them?
Yeah. So, the first thing that I think about is it's not even necessarily around finance, but getting your packaging retail ready. So if it doesn't pop on the shelf, you're going to be fighting an uphill battle for it to, you may get it on. The whole thing is you don't just want to sell in, you want to sell out. So getting into the retailer isn't the true win. It's the next PO and the next one, and not having to buy things back, right? Just understanding that retail can be very expensive. Once you're working with a retailer, once you're paying for promotions, I would advise them to maximize their margins ahead of time and potentially even have another more profitable channel to rely upon if possible. So let's say that you're able to go into, for a beauty brand, maybe you can go into like a hotel chain or something where you're able to go in. There's no promotions, right? You just sell it, you send it, they pay you what they told you they were going to pay, and you're done. And you're like, in and out, this is great. So there's certain alternative channels to retail that can be great to be in if you're also, wanting to get in retail. That's where, all that diversifying can help. I would also say consider going very deep on a region before you try to go wide. Because there are so many efficiencies, right, that you get by somebody talking about your brand at work, and then that person sees your brand, later that day versus they have to go out and buy it and pay for shipping and all those things, right? So kind of having some household penetration and really creating that crowd of super fans at home before you try and, go super wide, super big. And I would also say getting some expert help in reviewing contracts with retailers and distributors prior to signing, along with trade spend strategy. It's not necessarily that you can negotiate everything, but there are some areas where you can push back. And the important thing is that you model out all your numbers and understand what the road ahead will look like. There are growth strategists, that you can work with, people like yourself. And yeah, being strategic about your pricing and making sure that you are, with your pricing, you're leveraging, because it's huge, right? Pricing is huge. It's one of the things that you can't fix after the fact, right? You can only fix it by changing it. So leveraging consumer research, competitor comparison, also customizing by retailer, making sure that you're not, going into a specialty retailer with the same price that you're going to need to get at Walmart, right? Because then you can never get into Walmart. So not all of that necessarily has to do with finance, but that's just more so, general advice, because I want people to do well, right? And be happy with their performance at the end of the day.
I love that advice, though, Abby, because as I talk a lot about go-to-market strategy, a lot of the things that I reinforce and discuss are those things that you mentioned. And if the goal is to be successful at retail, as you mentioned, you don't want to have to buy back your inventory, because once you get to the shelf, the goal is for you to stay there at least for some extended period of time. And so all of those things, what your packaging looks like, having that relationship where you have true fans, people who are going to buy the product and dote on the product and share it organically on social media, that's all just going to help you once you get to that shelf to just scale and crush it, as I like to say. So thank you so much. This was such a good conversation. So much good information. If you want to go ahead and share where people can find you, Abby, and I'll make sure that we include it in the show notes.
Yes, of course. So I am at thecpgcfo.com. You can go to my website. There's a contact form. Send me a note. We can set up a call if you're, interested in talking, or just follow along on LinkedIn. So I post on LinkedIn every day. So be prepared, but it's good stuff. I hope, I talk about cash conversion cycle. I talk about contribution margin dollars. I talk about all these sorts of things, just managing your relationship with your co-packer, right? Just all that sort of business, leadership, finance type of content is what I post. I do also post on my blog, and I'm on Instagram at the CPG CFO. So you can find me. You can find me a lot of places.
After listening to that episode with Abby, I feel like there are things that I need to do within my own business to go back and make sure that I have things together. She offered so many actionable insights in terms of ways you can go back and check your books and make sure that we are all operating profitable, sustainable businesses. Thank you again, Abby, for joining us on the show. And for those of you who found this episode helpful, please, I encourage you, share it with a friend, share it with a colleague, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts so that we can continue to spread the knowledge and allow more people to get eyes on this podcast. Eyes and ears, right? Anyway, as always, thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll catch you on the next episode. Bye.